Nurses, in particular, are seen as guardians of life, professionals who provide not just medical care, but also comfort in moments of fear and pain. For decades, Charles Cullen wore that trusted uniform. To colleagues and patients, he appeared quiet, somewhat awkward, but dedicated to his work. Behind that facade, however, lay one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, a man who would come to be known by the chilling moniker, the Angel of Death. Over the course of 16 years, across multiple hospitals and nursing homes in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, Cullen quietly carried out a spree of killings so vast that investigators still struggle to determine its true scope. Officially, he confessed to 29 murders, but experts, prosecutors, and even Cullen himself admitted the number could be far higher, possibly hundreds. Born on February 22, 1960, in West Orange, New Jersey, he was the youngest of 8 children in a working-class Irish Catholic family. His father, a bus driver, died before Charles turned 1, leaving his mother to raise the children in a household overshadowed by grief and financial hardship. Cullen would later describe his childhood as lonely and miserable, a time marked more by loss than by warmth or stability. At school, Charles was a withdrawn and awkward boy. He struggled to make friends and was often the target of ridicule. Teachers noticed his isolation but rarely intervened. While other children were busy with sports or neighborhood games, Cullen retreated into himself, his world colored by sadness and resentment. By the time he was 9 years old, his troubles had already begun to surface in disturbing ways. That year, he attempted suicide for the first time by drinking chemicals from a chemistry set. It was a chilling sign of a child grappling with despair far beyond his years. The instability only grew worse. Cullen's adolescence was marked by multiple suicide attempts and ongoing struggles with depression. He would later recall feeling like an outcast not only at school, but within his own family. His siblings, burdened with their own struggles, could not provide him the emotional support he desperately needed. The one anchor in his life was his mother, Florence. She worked tirelessly to provide for the family, and Charles clung to her as his sole source of love and stability. But even that anchor was ripped away when tragedy struck again. In 1977, when Cullen was just 17, his mother died in a car accident. The loss devastated him, leaving him adrift and without direction. He later claimed the hospital's cold handling of her death, their refusal to allow him to see her body, deepened his bitterness toward the medical field, planting a seed of distrust and resentment that would later intertwine with his career. Cullen enrolled in the Mountainside Hospital School of Nursing in Montclair, New Jersey. Despite his awkward demeanor and social difficulties, he excelled academically. He was intelligent, meticulous, and dedicated to learning the technical aspects of medicine. Nursing school also offered him something he had rarely experienced before: respect. For the first time, he was not simply the misfit or the outcast. He was becoming a professional, someone entrusted with the lives of patients. In 1987, Cullen graduated and quickly secured his first position at St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, New Jersey. To colleagues, he appeared quiet and hardworking. He wasn't the type to draw attention, and in the fast-paced, often chaotic world of hospital care, that made him easy to overlook. Patients and families, meanwhile, saw him in uniform and assumed he was trustworthy simply because he was a nurse. Hospitals carry an unspoken contract with the public. Those who wear scrubs are there to help, not harm. Charles Cullen slipped into that trust as easily as he slipped into his hospital ED badge. Yet even in these early days, shadows lurked beneath the surface. Colleagues noticed that Cullen had a strange fascination with medication carts. He spent long hours alone, sometimes appearing at patients' bedsides without being assigned to their care. When questioned, he had explanations. He was checking in, helping out, covering for someone else. His quiet demeanor made it difficult to challenge him, And in a setting where teamwork was essential, few pressed the issue. For Charles Cullen, the hospital setting provided not only cover for his dark urges, but also the perfect tools to carry them out. His first confirmed murder took place in 1988 at St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, New Jersey. The victim was Judge John Yengo, a man recovering from an allergic reaction. By all accounts, Yengo was stabilizing, yet suddenly, without warning, he took a sharp turn for the worse. Unbeknownst to doctors and family, Cullen had slipped into the room and injected the patient's IV bag with a lethal dose of digoxin, a powerful heart medication that in large quantities causes cardiac arrest. The death was recorded as tragic but not suspicious. Hospitals were accustomed to losing patients, especially those already in fragile health. Cullen realized that this environment gave him an almost invisible weapon. If someone died, blame could be placed on illness, not foul play. The absence of blood, violence, or struggle meant his crimes blended seamlessly into the background noise of hospital mortality. Over the following years, Cullen repeated this method again and again. He preferred drugs like digoxin and insulin, medications he had easy access to, and which, when misused, caused sudden, catastrophic medical events. Insulin could send patients into fatal hypoglycemic shock, while digoxin interfered with heart rhythms. Both left doctors scrambling, trying to revive patients who seemed fine only hours earlier. The rapid decline confused medical teams and devastated families, but it never pointed directly to Cullen. What made Cullen even more dangerous was his ability to avoid suspicion. He operated in plain sight, yet his demeanor worked in his favor. He was quiet, soft-spoken, and seemingly dedicated to his work. He was not the type of nurse who raised alarms by being outwardly reckless or cruel. If anything, his colleagues often saw him as overly helpful, always lingering around medication carts or offering to check in on patients. Those behaviors might have seemed unusual, but in the busy rush of hospital life, they were dismissed as quirks of a shy man trying to fit in. When red flags did appear, such as sudden spikes in patient deaths during Cullen shifts, they were explained away as coincidences. Hospitals were reluctant to confront the possibility of intentional harm. Deaths in a medical setting were expected, and few administrators wanted to face the scandal that would come from accusing one of their own nurses of murder. Instead, concerns about Cullen were quietly noted, then brushed aside. For Cullen, each death reinforced a chilling truth. He had discovered a method of killing that was almost undetectable. Unlike the violence of traditional murderers, his killings left no fingerprints, no murder weapons abandoned in alleys, no witnesses to call the police. His syringe and IV bags were both his tools and his camouflage. By the early 1990s, Cullen had already begun weaving a trail of death through hospitals, and yet he remained invisible to those around him. The man who once felt powerless had now found a way to control life and death itself, an illusion of power he would exploit for years to come. The deaths followed Charles Cullen like a shadow, trailing him from one hospital to the next. Yet each time administrators grew uneasy, instead of sounding alarms, they opened the back door and quietly let him leave. Hospitals became stepping stones, not barriers, in his deadly career. The very institutions entrusted with saving lives, fearful of scandal and liability, chose silence over scrutiny. At St. Barnabas Medical Center, whispers began circulating soon after Cullen started working there. Too many patients under his care were dying unexpectedly, and his behavior around medication carts raised concerns. In 1992, an investigation into a series of suspicious IV fluid contaminations revealed that bags had been tampered with. Cullen was strongly suspected, but instead of calling police, the hospital allowed him to resign quietly. His departure was framed as a routine personnel change, and no report was filed with state authorities. Within weeks, he was working elsewhere, free to kill again. This pattern repeated itself again and again. At Warren Hospital in Phillipsburg, staff noticed unsettling trends. Patients who were recovering would suddenly crash without explanation, often during Cullen's shifts. Some even claimed to have seen him in their rooms late at night, administering medications they did not need. Complaints surfaced, but administrators, wary of lawsuits and reputational damage, handled the problem internally. Cullen once again resigned voluntarily. When he moved to Hunterdon Medical Center, the story was the same. Questions arose, red flags waved, but leadership preferred a quiet exit over accountability. Each resignation was treated like a problem solved, when in reality the danger was simply being passed along to another hospital, another set of patients. The failure was systemic. At the time, hospitals had no centralized reporting system to track suspicious medical staff. A nurse could be under investigation at one facility, walk out the door, and secure employment at another without difficulty. Cullen exploited this flaw with chilling ease. His resume remained intact, his references unchecked, and his reputation unblemished, at least on paper. What made these oversights all the more tragic was that evidence often pointed directly at him. Mortality rates spiked on his shifts. Colleagues quietly whispered about his odd behavior. Pharmacy records sometimes showed unexplained access to dangerous drugs. But instead of pushing further, hospital leaders calculated the risks of exposure. Investigating Cullen would mean admitting the possibility that dozens of patients had died not from illness, but from murder. It would mean lawsuits, headlines, and the collapse of public trust. To administrators, it was easier, safer, to let him slip away. For Cullen, these decisions were an unspoken invitation. Each time a hospital looked the other way, he learned that the system would protect itself, not its patients. The lack of accountability emboldened him. He moved seamlessly through New Jersey and Pennsylvania, leaving behind grieving families who believed their loved ones had died naturally. By the mid-1990s, Charles Cullen had become a phantom within the healthcare system, appearing, disappearing, and leaving devastation in his wake. And still, no one outside the hospitals had heard his name. The silence of administrators had become his greatest ally. By the mid-1990s, Charles Cullen's career as a nurse had already spanned several hospitals, and with each move, a trail of unexplained deaths followed. On paper, the fatalities looked like the unfortunate realities of medicine. Patients whose hearts gave out, whose conditions suddenly worsened. But when the data was later pieced together, a chilling pattern came into focus. Wherever Cullen worked, mortality rates spiked, and those deaths almost always occurred during his shifts. Cullen had perfected a method that blended seamlessly into his environment. He rarely killed impulsively. Instead, he studied hospital routines, learning where medications were stored and how records were kept. He selected drugs that were potent, easily accessible, and capable of causing sudden collapse. Digoxin to disrupt heart rhythms, insulin to send patients into fatal hypoglycemia, epinephrine to trigger heart failure. Sometimes he injected patients directly, but often he contaminated IV bags, ensuring that even if he wasn't in the room when a patient crashed, the outcome would still trace back to his hidden hand. This strategy gave him both control and cover. A contaminated IV bag could harm not just one patient, but any who received fluids from it, making deaths appear random. Even more chilling, the timing of symptoms often left no direct evidence of tampering. Doctors and nurses would rush in, baffled by the sudden decline, and families would be told their loved one had suffered an unforeseeable complication. The timeline of his killings stretched across institutions. At St. Barnabas, patients who were improving inexplicably died. At Warren Hospital, elderly patients nearing discharge suddenly collapsed. At Hunterdon Medical Center, nurses whispered about the uncanny frequency of codes, emergency resuscitations, during Cullen's shifts. Time and again, the sequence repeated. Cullen worked, patients died, administrators grew uneasy, and Cullen quietly moved on to his next job. What made him even harder to detect was the randomness of his victims. He did not fit the mold of killers who target specific profiles. His victims range from the elderly to the young, from the terminally ill to those expected to recover. Some were in pain while others were stable. This unpredictability made his actions nearly impossible to predict and masked them as part of the natural ebb and flow of hospital life. Yet there were signs for those willing to look closely. When researchers later analyzed hospital data, they discovered sharp spikes in mortality that aligned almost perfectly with Cullen's employment history. In one hospital, the death rate during his shifts nearly doubled compared to others. In another, medication discrepancies pointed directly to him. But in real time, these clues remain fragmented, lost within paperwork, bureaucracy, and the reluctance of institutions to confront a nightmare possibility that a nurse in their care was systematically killing patients. For Cullen, the lack of consequences only deepened his sense of power. He once told investigators that killing became a compulsion, something he felt driven to do. Each death was both an experiment and a dark release, reinforcing the notion that he could control life itself. By the end of the decade, the pattern was undeniable to anyone who later studied the records. Charles Cullen was not a healer who occasionally made mistakes. He was a predator, and hospitals had become his hunting grounds. As the 1990s gave way to the early 2000s, Charles Cullen's reputation among colleagues grew increasingly troubling. Nurses and staff who worked alongside him couldn't help but notice the unsettling coincidences. Patients who were stable often declined rapidly during his shifts. 4 bags seemed to go missing or appear tampered with, and Cullen himself was frequently found in rooms where he had no reason to be, hovering by bedside the dim hours of the night. Whispers spread in break rooms and hallways. Some nurses voiced their fears directly to supervisors, reporting that Cullen's behavior was more than odd. It was dangerous. At Warren Hospital, for instance, 3 elderly women died under mysterious circumstances, each after allegedly being injected with digoxin. One patient, before losing consciousness, even claimed a sneaky male nurse had entered her room to give her an injection. Staff members relayed the account to administrators, but rather than treat it as evidence, officials dismissed it as the confusion of an aging patient. At other hospitals, similar concerns were brushed aside. Colleagues noticed Cullen hanging around medication stations far too often, pulling drugs that didn't match his assigned patients. When questioned, he gave vague explanations about helping out or preparing for emergencies. Nurses complained, pharmacists flagged discrepancies, and patterns were noted, but hospital administrators preferred to downplay the warnings. The problem wasn't ignorance, it was fear. If administrators admitted that a nurse under their roof might be deliberately harming patients, they would be forced to confront a scandal of enormous proportions. Lawsuits could drain finances, public trust could collapse, patients' families might demand investigations that could expose systemic negligence. To many hospital leaders, it was easier and safer to protect the institution's reputation rather than risk the truth. Time and again, the solution was to quietly ease Cullen out. At St. Barnabas, he resigned after suspicions arose over tainted EV bags. At Warren, despite growing unease among staff, administrators negotiated his departure instead of calling authorities. Each resignation letter became a ticket to his next job, where the cycle of death began anew. The voices of concerned nurses and staff were effectively silenced, not because no one believed them, but because believing them meant admitting the unthinkable. For those who worked alongside Cullen, the inaction was maddening. Dedicated nurses who had chosen their profession to save lives were left powerless, watching as their warnings went unheeded. Some later recalled the frustration of knowing something was wrong but being told in so many words to drop it. Their cries for justice became echoes in empty boardrooms, drowned out by the hum of administrators protecting the hospital brand. Meanwhile, patients continued to die. Families wept at funerals, convinced their loved ones had been taken by fate or illness, never knowing that behind the hospital doors, colleagues had already sounded alarms that went ignored. The silence of administrators was more than negligence, it was complicity. And with every ignored warning, Charles Cullen grew bolder, convinced that the very system meant to stop him would always look the other way. By the early 2000s, Charles Cullen had drifted through more than a dozen medical facilities across New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Each hospital told the same silent story: sudden deaths, unexplained crashes, and unsettling whispers from colleagues who suspected something darker was at work. For years, administrators had chosen to look the other way, but the pattern had grown too glaring to ignore. It was only a matter of time before law enforcement and medical experts began to connect the dots. The turning point came at Somerset Medical Center in Somerville, New Jersey. There, staff noticed an alarming rise in code blues, emergency resuscitations, especially during Cullen's shifts. Pharmacists flagged discrepancies in medication logs, pointing to his repeated, unauthorized access to drugs like digoxin and insulin. Nurses began voicing their concerns more forcefully. For once, the suspicions weren't simply brushed aside. Somerset's administration, though reluctant, realized they had a crisis they could no longer manage quietly. In 2002, the hospital alerted the New Jersey Poison Control Center, which in turn brought in medical experts. Dr. Stephen Marcus, director of the center, studied the data and immediately recognized the red flags: the sudden clustering of deaths, the drug patterns, the timing of patient declines. All of it suggested deliberate tampering rather than random chance. Marcus urged Somerset to take swift action and notify authorities. Soon after, the New Jersey State Police became involved. Detectives began the painstaking process of piecing together a timeline of deaths and cross-referencing them with Cullen's shifts. The numbers were staggering. Again and again, the pattern emerged. Patients who were stable declined rapidly during his hours on duty, while the drugs responsible for their deaths were accessed using his credentials. The investigation expanded beyond Somerset. Law enforcement began reaching out to other hospitals where Cullen had worked. Each facility told a hauntingly familiar story: an increase in unexplained deaths during his tenure, suspicions whispered but never acted upon, and Cullen's quiet departure before questions grew too loud. When detectives lined up the data, the scope of his crimes became horrifyingly clear. This wasn't a nurse who had made a mistake or even committed one or two murders. This was a serial killer operating under the guise of a caregiver, leaving a trail of bodies stretching back over a decade. Still, the case was not easy to prove. Cullen had chosen his methods carefully, using drugs that left little trace after death. Autopsies were rarely performed on elderly or critically ill patients, meaning much of the evidence had been lost. Investigators had to rely on patterns, pharmacy logs, and testimony from colleagues who had long suspected him. It was circumstantial, but the weight of it was overwhelming. By late 2003, detectives knew they were closing in. Cullen's quiet facade could no longer shield him from scrutiny. For the first time in his career, the walls of silence that had protected him for so long were starting to crack. And as investigators prepared their case, the angel of death would soon find himself with nowhere left to hide. Inside Somerset Medical Center, fear and unease were spreading fast. By 2002, staff had begun to accept what administrators were reluctant to admit: someone in their ranks was killing patients. The strange crashes, the unexplained drug access, and the sharp rise in deaths during Charles Cullen's shifts were too glaring to ignore. While the hospital leadership stalled, some brave nurses and staff decided to take matters into their own hands. They became the whistleblowers. the hidden voices that would ultimately bring Cullen down. Two of the most critical figures were Amy Lochran, a fellow nurse and one of Cullen's closest friends, and the hospital's pharmacy staff, who had long suspected that something was wrong with the medication records. Amy had worked alongside Cullen for years. To her, he had always been quiet, awkward, but seemingly kind. She considered him a friend. Yet when investigators approached her with their suspicions, showing her pharmacy logs that pointed directly at Cullen, she was shaken to her core. It was not an easy decision, but Amy agreed to help. She began secretly working with the police, wearing a wire and recording conversations with Cullen. Investigators knew that Cullen trusted her, and they hoped he might let down his guard around her. These undercover conversations were tense and haunting. Amy had to pretend everything was normal while gently probing for admissions of guilt. Each time she sat with Cullen, her heart pounded, knowing she was speaking face to face with someone who might confess to killing dozens, perhaps hundreds of patients. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the pharmacy staff were quietly tracking medication usage. They noticed that Cullen repeatedly signed out dangerous drugs like digoxin and insulin for patients who had no medical need for them. Every entry left a paper trail, and as the logs piled up, the case against him grew stronger. The pharmacists shared their findings with detectives, ensuring that the suspicions weren't buried by administrators intent on protecting the hospital's reputation. It wasn't just Amy and the pharmacists. Other nurses, too, had raised alarms and cooperated discreetly with police. They documented strange behavior, reported inconsistencies, and in some cases, relayed stories from patients who had described Cullen's unexpected late-night visits. These small pieces of evidence, when woven together, created a chilling picture of systematic murder. For the whistleblowers, the emotional toll was immense. They had dedicated their lives to healing, yet they were forced to confront the horrifying reality that one of their own was betraying everything the profession stood for. Worse, many feared retaliation, not from Cullen, but from hospital leadership, who seemed more intent on silencing concerns than exposing the truth. Despite the risks, the whistleblowers pressed forward. Their courage, combined with the persistence of investigators, finally pierced the veil of secrecy that had shielded Cullen for so long. Without them, his crimes might have remained hidden, and more patients would have died under his care. In the end, it was not just law enforcement that brought Charles Cullen down. It was the bravery of those inside the hospital walls, the colleagues who refused to let silence become complicity. By late 2003, investigators had gathered enough suspicions, pharmacy records, and testimony to know Charles Cullen was killing patients. But suspicion alone would not be enough in court. They needed his words, his admissions, something concrete to pierce through the fog of circumstantial evidence. To get it, they designed a sting operation, and at the center of it was the one person Cullen still trusted, Nurse Amy Lochran. Amy had already begun cooperating with detectives, though the decision weighed heavily on her. Cullen had been her friend. They shared long shifts, late-night conversations, even confidences about personal struggles. To betray that friendship was agonizing, but she knew she had no choice. If she didn't help, more patients would die. Police fitted her with recording devices, wires hidden under her clothes, and coached her on how to subtly steer conversations. The meetings were nerve-wracking. Amy would sit across from Cullen in diners, parking lots, or hospital break rooms, trying to keep her voice steady as she asked him about the deaths. Cullen, guarded and paranoid, never gave a full confession, but his words revealed cracks. He admitted that he wasn't supposed to be talking and hinted at things he had done. Each vague statement was captured on tape, inching investigators closer to what they needed. At the same time, police tightened surveillance around him. Detectives watched his movements, monitored his access to drugs, and mapped out every hospital where he had worked. The case was sprawling, covering more than a dozen facilities across 2 states, and investigators feared he might slip away again if they didn't act fast. Every day he remained free was another day patients were at risk. The tension inside Somerset Medical Center grew unbearable. Staff members whispered that a killer was among them, while administrators anxiously waited for the police to make their move. Some nurses avoided Cullen, fearful of what he might do. Others, who had long suspected him, quietly hoped each shift would be his last. Finally, in December 2003, detectives decided the time had come. They arranged for Amy to meet Cullen at a local restaurant. The meeting spot was a diner in Somerset County, a quiet place where Cullen often felt comfortable speaking with his colleague and confidant. She had been working undercover for weeks, wearing a wire, gently pressing him about the strange deaths at Somerset Medical Center. Though Cullen never gave a full admission, his guarded words revealed enough to convince detectives that he was ready to break. This diner meeting was intended to be the final push. Amy sat across from him, her heart pounding as the wire beneath her clothes transmitted every word to police waiting nearby. Cullen spoke in his usual quiet, flat tone, but there was a tension in his demeanor. He hinted at things he had done, at actions he shouldn't have taken. He told Amy he felt trapped, that he couldn't stop. For Amy, it was the confirmation she dreaded. The man she had once trusted as a friend was admitting, in his own way, to being a killer. Outside, unmarked police cars surrounded the diner parking lot. Detectives watched from a distance, waiting for the signal. When the conversation reached its breaking point, they moved in. The scene unfolded quickly. Officers entered the diner, approaching Cullen as he sat in his booth. Customers glanced up from their breakfast, puzzled by the sudden commotion. Cullen didn't fight, didn't shout, didn't even ask why. When detectives told him he was under arrest, he simply lowered his head, his expression unreadable. In a matter of seconds, handcuffs were snapped around his wrists, the clink of metal echoing through the diner. For the investigators, it was a moment of relief, the culmination of months of painstaking work, and the end of a nightmare that had haunted hospitals for nearly 2 decades. For Amy, watching her former friend led out in handcuffs, it was devastating but necessary. She later described the moment as surreal, a collision of betrayal and justice she would never forget. News of the arrest spread quickly. Headlines called him a hospital killer, a serial nurse, and most chillingly, the angel of death. Families who had long accepted their loved ones' deaths as natural began to question everything. Hospitals scrambled to explain how Cullen had been allowed to move undetected for so long. But in that diner, on that cold December morning, all of that was still to come. For Charles Cullen, the killing was over. For the investigators, the long process of uncovering the full scale of his crimes had only just begun. After his arrest in December 2003, Charles Cullen was brought into custody, and investigators finally had their chance to confront the man who had haunted hospital wards for nearly 2 decades. What they heard in those interrogation rooms would leave them stunned, sickened, and overwhelmed by the sheer scale of his crimes. At first, Cullen was guarded. He gave short answers, avoiding eye contact, and seemed almost detached from reality. But as the questioning wore on, detectives noticed something peculiar. When the conversation turned to his patients, he spoke more freely, almost matter-of-factly, as if he were discussing routine medical tasks rather than murder. Then slowly the confessions began to spill out. He admitted to injecting patients with lethal doses of drugs, most often digoxin, a heart medication, or insulin, both of which could quietly push a vulnerable patient into cardiac arrest or hypoglycemia. Sometimes he used other medications, snatched from hospital storerooms, depending on what was available. His methods were chillingly simple. Slip into a supply room, remove a vial, and inject it into an IV bag or directly into a patient's bloodstream. When investigators pressed him on the number of victims, Cullen gave an answer that sent shockwaves through the room. He couldn't remember. He said the killings had become too many to count. At one point, he estimated that he might have murdered as many as 40 patients. Later, under further questioning, that number rose. He hinted at hundreds. To this day, the true number remains uncertain, with experts believing it could be anywhere from 40 to more than 400. What struck detectives most was not just the numbers, but the way Cullen described his acts. He didn't rant, didn't shout, didn't even seem remorseful. Instead, he spoke in a flat, clinical tone, as though his killings were part of his job. He even suggested that he had been relieving suffering, claiming he ended patients' pain. But when investigators compared his claims with the medical records, they found that many victims had not been terminally ill. Some were even recovering and expected to leave the hospital. Cullen's justification crumbled under the evidence. Families were soon notified of his admissions. The grief was indescribable. For years, many had accepted that their loved ones died naturally, never suspecting foul play. Now they were told those deaths were not accidents of fate, but deliberate acts by a nurse entrusted with care. Lawsuits mounted and the public demanded to know how hospitals had allowed such a predator to thrive. Cullen's confessions became a turning point in the investigation. They not only confirmed the suspicions of law enforcement, but also opened the door to one of the largest medical murder cases in history. Every new admission brought another wave of sorrow as more names were added to the growing list of victims. The angel of death had finally spoken, and the world now understood the chilling truth. Charles Cullen had transformed hospitals, places of healing, into his hunting grounds, and his tally of victims might never be fully known. When Charles Cullen finally stepped into a courtroom, the world waited to see how the so-called angel of death would face justice. After years of working in the shadows, quietly taking lives behind hospital curtains, he was now under the brightest lights imaginable, before a judge, a jury, and the grieving families of his victims. Cullen's trial was unlike many others. Instead of denying the charges or attempting to fight them, he entered the courtroom ready to plead guilty. Over the course of multiple hearings, he admitted to dozens of murders across New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Each guilty plea was like a knife to the families in attendance, who wept openly as they heard their loved ones' names read aloud, followed by Cullen's cold acknowledgement of what he had done. What stunned many observers, however, was Cullen's demeanor. He sat slouched in his chair, eyes often cast downward, speaking in a monotone voice. He showed no visible remorse, no tears, no apologies. When asked directly why he killed, his answers were vague and unsettling. He repeated the idea that he was relieving suffering, even though countless victims had not been terminally ill. His explanations seemed more like excuses than confessions. The victims' families were given the opportunity to speak, and their statements filled the courtroom with raw emotion. Mothers, fathers, children, and spouses stood before Cullen, their voices breaking as they described the devastating loss he had inflicted. Some demanded answers he refused to give. Others expressed rage, calling him a coward who preyed on the vulnerable. A few told him they hoped he would never again see freedom. At one point, the courtroom descended into chaos. During a sentencing hearing, as Cullen stood before the judge, he repeatedly tried to disrupt the proceedings by muttering and demanding silence. When the judge warned him to stop, Cullen continued, forcing sheriff's deputies to place a gag over his mouth to keep him quiet. The image of the nurse-turned-killer, muzzled in court, became one of the most haunting moments of the trial. It was a chilling reflection of his inability, or unwillingness, to confront the enormity of his crimes. Ultimately, Charles Cullen was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. It was a punishment designed to ensure he would never again walk free, never again set foot in a hospital, and never again have the chance to harm another soul. For the families, the sentences brought some measure of justice, but no true closure. Many left the courtroom still haunted by unanswered questions. Why their loved one? Could Cullen have been stopped sooner? How many more victims would remain forever unnamed? The courtroom drama marked the end of Cullen's reign of terror, but it also underscored the systemic failures that allowed him to operate unchecked for so long. As he was led away in shackles, the families were left to pick up the pieces, carrying the scars of his crimes long after the trial ended. Long after Charles Cullen was sentenced, one haunting question continued to echo through courtrooms, hospital corridors, and the hearts of grieving families. How many people did he really kill? During his confessions, Cullen admitted to roughly 40 murders, but investigators quickly realized this was only the tip of the iceberg. His career spanned 16 years in at least 9 different hospitals across New Jersey and Pennsylvania. In that time, thousands of patients had passed through his care. Many deaths have been labeled natural, written off as complications, or never investigated at all. The deeper authorities dug, the more they saw a terrifying pattern. Wherever Cullen worked, death rates rose dramatically during his shifts. Forensic toxicologists worked tirelessly to uncover the truth. They exhumed bodies, tested tissue samples, and combed through hospital records for irregularities. Some findings were conclusive: digoxin or insulin levels that could only have been caused by deliberate injection. Others remained inconclusive, lost to time, poor record keeping, or the natural breakdown of chemicals in the human body. Every unanswered case hinted at another victim whose story would never be fully told. Experts began estimating that Cullen's actual victim count could be well over 300, possibly even more. This staggering number would make him the most prolific serial killer in American history, a title chilling in its enormity. Unlike killers who prowled streets or hunted strangers, Cullen had hidden in plain sight, cloaked in the trust of a nurse's uniform, taking lives in the very place people expected healing. What horrified investigators most was the randomness. Cullen did not always target terminal patients, despite his claims of relieving suffering. Many of his victims were on the mend, preparing to go home. Some were young, others elderly, but all were vulnerable, trusting in the system meant to protect them. His motives, whether rooted in a twisted sense of mercy, compulsion, or a hunger for control, remained murky. What was clear was that no one was safe when he walked the halls of a hospital. For the families, the uncertainty was unbearable. Some learned with certainty that their loved ones were among Cullen's victims. Others were left in limbo, suspecting but never knowing for sure. The possibility that hundreds of lives were stolen without justice tore open wounds that could never fully heal. The true toll of Cullen's crimes could never be calculated with precision. Records were incomplete, evidence lost, and many deaths forever buried under hospital bureaucracy. But one fact stood beyond dispute: Charles Cullen had transformed hospitals, symbols of care and recovery, into silent hunting grounds. By the time investigators closed their books, Cullen was recognized not just as a serial killer, but as a catastrophic failure of oversight. His crimes forced the medical world to confront its blind spots and to reckon with the reality that trust, once broken, leaves scars on entire communities. The Angel of Death's final legacy was not only the hundreds of lives he likely ended, but also the chilling reminder that the real number would forever remain unknown.